Welcome to Absolute Trust Talk with your host, Kirsten Howe. Absolute Trust Talk brings you tips, tools, advice, and interviews to help you build a reliable knowledge base on estate planning, business, and finance to start preparing for your future today.
Hello, and welcome to Absolute Trust Talk. I am Kirsten Howe, managing attorney here at Absolute Trust Counsel. And in our last episode, we were talking with my guest, Anthony Kim, about IRS audits, and we ran out of time. So I've got him here again for another episode to complete our conversation about audits and what happens in the whole process. We only got through about a third of it. So I'm going to have him back. Just as a reminder, Tony Kim is a founder of the law firm Kim and Rosado, which is here in Walnut Creek. And he now specializes in assisting clients with federal and state tax matters. He represents people before the IRS, and he does this using his 26 years of experience working for the IRS, representing the government against taxpayers. So very valuable experience, all the inside knowledge he uses for his clients now. In our last episode, we talked about the audit phase, and what happens at the end of that is the IRS representative makes a determination and says, okay, this is what's going to happen. And the taxpayer then either says that's fine or they file a protest letter. Tony, welcome back. Tell us what happens in this protest letter.
Sure. So after the agent has made his or her determination of what is correct or incorrect, the taxpayer gets an opportunity to submit a protest letter. And in the protest letter sent to the agent who made these findings, the taxpayer then outlines what he or she believes are incorrect determinations. The agent can then say, you're right. I made a mistake. In 26 years, I've never seen an agent say, you're right, I made a mistake. So although that's the intent of a protest letter, effectively that
it doesn't
yield an admission of error.
Well, let me stop you there. Is that because they never make mistakes, or they are just not willing to acknowledge when they have made a mistake?
I'm going to say, well, I think tax is complex. I'm going to dodge that one. Tax is complex, and everyone can make errors, including judges and IRS folks.
Sure.
Everyone can make errors. So I think it's inherent on all of us. When we're called out and we're told, well, you made an error, it's hard to step back and say, let me think about that. But that is the intent of a protest letter, to say, well, you made an error. Here's where you made an error. The most typical response is no response. They're going to reject the protest letter. And then it goes to where the protest letter then seeks further review. And that is the Office of Appeals.
Okay.
Rather than a revenue agent, now a different government official for the IRS is assigned, who is called an appeals officer. And an appeals officer for the IRS has a very different function or mission statement, whereas a revenue agent is supposed to find errors and make determinations that are correct. Yeah. An appeals officer is not in that category or role. An appeals officer looks at both sides, much like a settlement officer. And the function of an appeals officer is to look at both sides equally, favoring neither side, and saying, if this case were to go to court, who has the better argument? They're weighing the positives and the negatives of both. And the function of the appeals officer is to essentially clean out the system so that there's less litigation in the courts, clogging the courts, and saying, what can I do as a settlement officer to weed out and determine what's unnecessary to go to court?
Like what mediation that we have in civil court. Yeah,
exactly. So although the IRS appeals officer has an IRS badge, is an IRS employee, they function as a mediator.
Okay.
A paid mediator by the public to resolve conflict that should not go to litigation. So they'll weigh the positives and the negatives, and then they, unlike the revenue agent, can make a settlement offer. They may say, Kirsten, I've looked at what the revenue agent put in his or her report and the authorities and the elements that they say is deficient. And I've looked at your protest letter, which is your side of the story, and the facts and where you've identified problems and the legal authorities supporting your position. And based on looking at both sides, I believe that there are hazards for you and hazards for the government. And therefore, I'd like to offer you a settlement. And it could be 50%, it could be 30% benefiting one or the other, or it could be a total concession on all issues, on one issue or more. So the appeals officer may very well say, I had this recently. I represented a client before appeals, and the IRS revenue agent's report said, well, over 3 years, the taxpayer has multiple adjustments that result in $2 million and change dollars of additional tax. I presented a protest letter and I advocated for the taxpayer in appeals, and the $2,100,000 additional tax went down to about $2,000.
Wow.
Yeah, and there the appeals officer looked at the protest letter and all the arguments that I presented, all with the focus that if we go to court, the government faces significant hazards.
Hazards meaning they have a risk of not prevailing.
Right.
And using all these resources to pursue something that they're very unlikely to get.
Right. And so as a litigator, what I did was I created about 20 some organized volumes of the record, along with supporting authorities. And I said, here's what I would present on behalf of the taxpayer in court. It's overwhelming, the information. I don't know why the agent did not consider all this. Perhaps it was because the taxpayer presented in a disorganized fashion and the agent just said, I can't make sense of this. I'm not sure exactly why, but here's information. The taxpayer is going to win. The appeals officer can either be convinced by it and concede, as in my case.
Right.
Or the appeals officer may say, I'm not convinced, and therefore I'm going to sustain and support what the revenue agent did in audit. It can happen one of two ways: full concession, full support of the IRS, or something in between.
Something in the middle.
Yeah. And then I'd say generally 90% of cases resolve at appeals. So It's always a good idea to go to IRS appeals.
If you don't like the outcome of the audit, write your letter of protest.
You should always avail yourself of that opportunity and present the reasons why the IRS agent perhaps was not competent or didn't look at the facts as well as he or she should have. So if that's the case, what's called litigation hazards are assessed by the appeals officer. And then there's a settlement offer that's presented, and hopefully that resolves the case. If that's not resolved, then the next opportunity for the taxpayer is to go to court. The taxpayer can go to one of two venues: U.S. tax court, which is a prepayment forum. So you can go to court without having to pay the tax first.
Oh, okay.
Or the taxpayer can then go to U.S. district court, and that is not a prepayment forum.
You got to pay the tax.
You've got to pay. And that's the only way you get into that court. And most taxpayers are aligned with the prepayment forum. So they don't want to pay because they don't feel that they owe the additional tax. They just want the court to review their case.
Sure. Okay, so if you, in this appeal, you get a result that you're not happy with, but you're willing to accept it, that's the end of it. The IRS can't then go to court. The taxpayer is the only one who can push it to the litigation.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Once the IRS makes a determination, the only person that can take the matter to court is the taxpayer.
Okay. So now we're in the litigation phase, which is what you used to do with the IRS because you are an attorney. Talk about what happens there.
So by the time an attorney like me who represents the IRS gets a case for litigation, where the IRS attorneys are representing the commissioner in court, the IRS attorneys take their responsibility by looking at what's been done before, which is the revenue agent's report. And we will also have the appeals officer's assessment of what was offered and rejected, which got us to court. Right. We look at everything, and then the starting point is we will then look at the revenue agent's report to see, well, is that correct? If it is incorrect, then the attorney is supposed to concede it. The facts weren't there, the documents weren't there. We don't understand why the position was taken, because the attorney is an officer of the court. Not only is the attorney representing the IRS, but they are an officer of the court. So if there's some misalignment of facts to law, then the attorney should say, no, we, on behalf of the commissioner, we concede. You
can't make a non-ethical argument that you're a lawyer, you're an officer of the court. You're not allowed to do that.
It rarely happens, but that is the initial assessment. The attorney, even though the attorney represents the commissioner, says, do the facts and law support what's written in the IRS's position? Now, most of the times, that a case is assigned to an attorney for the IRS, they will say yes. And that is a position taken by the attorney for the IRS, supporting the original audit adjustment.
Okay.
Now, a question may come up, well, what if during appeals there was an offer of 50-50 split? So the IRS agent says it's 100%, it's $10,000 additional tax. The IRS appeals officer said, no, we'll split it 50-50. It's not 10,000, it's 5,000. What is the starting point by the time it gets to litigation?
For the litigation.
The 5,000 is no longer on the table.
Off the table. Yeah.
You rejected it.
You rejected it. Yeah.
So that's not the starting point. The starting point is the adjustment that's in the revenue agent's report. That said, there needs to be a clear understanding that just because that's a starting point, the IRS attorney can take it one of two ways. One is, while the agent reached the determination of $10,000 liability, the IRS attorney may say, well, I've looked at the various adjustments. There are two that should not have been made because it's incorrect, not supported by factual law. And they may concede the two, which makes it from 10,000 to 8.
Okay.
On the other side, I may look at the case and say, well, gosh, the case file notes that they didn't do 1, 2, and 3, these adjustments. The file is ripe with all the information. They should have made the adjustment. I'm going to make the adjustment. Can I do that? Can I increase from where the IRS agent started? I can.
I wouldn't say, yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't. Yeah.
If the facts compel a certain result, I'd say, well, I'm going to take the case where the facts lead me and the law.
Right.
I've done this sometimes where an agent did not impose a penalty.
Oh.
I look at the case and I say, well, the penalty should have been imposed.
Okay.
And I will assert the penalty through pleading.
Got it.
So it can get better or it can get worse.
It can get worse. Right.
So what I would recommend, and the viewers here, if you're in appeals and you get an offer of settlement, don't think that that's a starting point and it can only get better if you go to litigation. It can get worse because that is not the starting point.
Right.
It can get worse. And there you're dealing with an appeals officer normally is not an attorney. They're usually non-attorneys and they're looking at the protest letter and the revenue agent's report. When I get a case, I start with the revenue agent's report, but I'm looking at everything.
Mm-hmm.
What is the correct result? And it may be less, it may be more. So be careful when you decide to reject the officer's settlement and say, well, I'm going to take the IRS to court. Be careful. There are risks and rewards.
Right. Okay. So, and all of that is fascinating. That's fascinating to get that inside view of how it's handled. But you now are on the outside going up against the IRS. What kinds of things do you see, strategies you like to use? I'm not asking you to share your secrets, but things that our audience would find helpful to know about.
I think one is a useful strategy is just to manage the process. So typically what happens is taxpayers don't have the most complete or organized records. And it's just to organize it in a fashion where it's easy to read. So I wouldn't say it's dumbing down anything, but it's presenting in an organized fashion. That is a strategy. I think a strategy can be, well, I'm just going to dump paper. And as long as I dump paper, it will waste time. It'll frustrate the other side. That is a strategy. I don't find that a very useful strategy.
A helpful strategy. Yeah.
No, because it's frustrating. It creates a certain reaction on the other side. So my view is you want to work cooperatively with the government, not as adversaries. And I think some people would disagree.
I find that to be an interesting viewpoint. You know, we help people with qualifying for Medi-Cal, and that can be a very difficult process, is actually submitting the application. And we encourage them to use somebody, not do it yourself, and submit everything in a nice, neat package, organized, tabs, whatever it takes, because you want the person on the other side to not get mad at you and not be frustrated with you, and to pick up your file and go, okay, I can deal with this. I'm going to look at this today. So I think it's similar approach.
Yeah. It's how you want, I guess the saying is, treat other people as you would want to be treated. And when you deal with the IRS, and we started some time ago about how the IRS for many people triggers a certain response and certain reaction. Yeah. And so you think you want your automatically in an adversarial posture. And that's not the case I've worked with many agents throughout the country. And I think uniformly, they want to discharge their responsibilities equitably and fairly and with as much professionalism as they can employ. Now, it goes both ways. So if they're dealing with a professional, then they will be professional in response. Now, if you're dealing with someone who's unprofessional, it becomes very difficult to have an intelligent conversation and a dialogue, and things go sideways. And so 2 things I would recommend is, 1, focus on dealing with the IRS in a non-adversarial fashion. That is, yes, you are in adversarial positions, but treat the IRS in a non-adversarial posture. That is, don't try to go out of your way to make things difficult.
Right.
So that's one. The other thing that I've seen in practice also is when a representative is hired, sometimes the representative, whether they're a CPA or an attorney, in my experience, seem to create unnecessary adversarial situations. As someone that worked cases, I had a docket of cases. I just wanted to get my caseload off my desk. So I'll get it from A to B, closed, done. If there's not compliance, figure it out. If there's a legal issue that needs to be determined equitably and correctly, then let me do that. But let me get my cases done. However, if there was someone who was unduly adversarial, it slowed down my work and it created unnecessary friction and delay. And oftentimes I would say, let's say, Kirsten, you were the taxpayer and somebody's representing you, but they were being unnecessarily difficult. I would tell the representative, I would like you to bring the principal, the taxpayer, in our next meeting, because I would like you to hear from me what's working and what's not.
Okay.
And the rep never brought the principal in.
It never happens.
Never happened. And I suspect that the representative would say to their client, it's Tony. He's being
unreasonable. He's making this much harder than it needs to be.
In an overarching statement rather than going into specifics of, explain to me how he's being difficult.
Right.
So it created this situation where I thought it's not in the public interest. It's not certainly in the taxpayer's interest that this get prolonged. I think probably the only person that is gaining from this impasse is only one party.
Yeah, the attorney who's charging by the hour. Yep.
And what I recommend taxpayers do is, once you decide that you're going to have a representative, maybe at some point, say, let's have a sit down. I don't want to be interviewed. I don't want to be part of it, but I'd certainly like to hear from the government's representative how things are going. I don't need to know the substance, but are you getting the information timely? And are you being treated professionally? I just want to hear those things, the answers. And if the government official says, yes, I'm getting timely responses and your representative is acting professionally, then that's all I need to know.
That's all you need to know. Yeah.
Oftentimes, I think particularly with attorneys for the other side, when I was on the government side, attorneys in the private sector, I think more often than not tended to want to create a dust up often. And so, as you noted, I worked 26 years for the IRS, and there are a lot of dust ups. So much so that when my son, after completing a couple of years of work after college, he asked me, what do you think about me going to law school? I said, Mom and Dad are not going to pay for that. And he asked me why. He said, you always wanted education and advocated for education. I said, well, I've had 26 years of working in controversy, and that was not soul fulfilling.
I don't want that life for you.
I know better. So pick something else. So given my experience, I'd say there's the nature of tax with the IRS lends itself to controversy. You'd want the representatives to do the best job for you. But what is old saying? Good fences make good neighbors. Make sure that the guidelines are there. So that keep your representative focused. Make sure that they are doing the job that they've been hired to do. And sometimes things sort of go sideways. So advice, when you do hire a representative, make sure to keep yourself somewhat involved and ensure that they are doing the job for your benefit, not for theirs.
Not their benefit. Yeah. That is good advice when hiring a lawyer generally, right?
That's why, particularly with referrals, if you know somebody, you trust somebody, let's say, and I certainly have known you, Kirsten, If I was looking for a professional, I'd want a referral from you, someone I trust,
Right.
rather than going to some site that I don't know. Maybe the site has reviews that are, pumped up from other people that have an investment in the firm. I don't know, but I'm not going to go off of reviews. I want a trusted referral.
Yeah. Good advice. Good advice. Tony, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of information with us. My guest has been Tony Kim with Kim and Rosado, and a very experienced IRS litigator, now representing taxpayers before the IRS, and very successfully, it sounds like. Thank you very much. It's been quite a pleasure.
It's a pleasure being with you, Kirsten. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you learned a lot. I know I did. And we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Absolute Trust Talk Live. If you enjoyed listening in, then don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen by searching Absolute Trust Talk. While you're there, we would also love for you to leave us a review. And then why not share your favorite episodes with family, friends, or colleagues too? You can find all of our shows and corresponding show notes by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com. You'll also find a variety of other free resources, including our ebooks, videos, blogs, presentations, and more. If you need help with your estate planning or administration, we also offer a free discovery call to help get the process started. You can find more information on booking your session by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com/scheduling. If you join us for the broadcast, you can submit questions during the show. But if not, don't worry. You can always get in touch with us by sending a quick message to info@absolutetrustcouncil.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.
This podcast is not meant to take the place of legal advice from an attorney and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you do have a legal question or issue, please consult with an attorney.